truth is the most convincing story that maps onto reality, and that's why the central narrative is falling apart.
Right now in the United States, people should not be walking around with masks.
We must see the central narrative for the fiction that it is. We are Americans.
While elections are sometimes messy, this was a secure election.
The founders began the fight for human liberty and self-governance, and it's up to us to finish the job.
I'll tell you what, we are in a truth emergency right now.
This is the end game.
It's Tuesday, September 26th, 2023, the 979th day of dystopia. I'm your moderator, Chris Paul. Let's be reasonable. A warm welcome and hello to all of you listening to the podcast on the day of its release. The only way to do that is by becoming a paid subscriber at imyourmoderator.substack.com. You can do so for as little as $50 a year or $5 a month. And in doing so, you will be supporting me, the work I do, and this show as it expands. And if you can't, or you simply don't want to, continue listening to the podcast for free a couple days later on a wide variety of podcast platforms and, of course, Rumble. All I ask is that you share it with your friends. You can find the links to the podcast, the writing, the social media, and the merch site by visiting linktree.com/I'mYourModerator. So today I want to kind of continue our catching up process by getting into this indictment of Democrat Senator from New Jersey, Robert Menendez. Now, this isn't a breaking news show, and it never has been. I've never wanted it to be. And I actually said that, and I think the first episode I ever did of this show. Back then in early 2020, I was using this podcast platform called Anchor, and they would have you record a little trailer describing what your show was about. And I remember saying in that trailer that I didn't want to be one of those hot take shows like every other podcast, essentially. They just listen to the central narrative as it develops, and then they give their immediate reactions to what they're hearing. And whoever's able to have the best hot take gets really popular. And that's how things were on the legacy social media platforms and on YouTube shows and podcasts. It would be all about who has the most interesting hot take about the current issue. And while that isn't as bad as it used to be, it's still dominant in the mainstream culture, in the big podcasts, the big YouTube shows. All the social media content produced by the uniparty influencers on the right and left. Some news story from the central narrative goes viral, and then it is a feeding frenzy. Everyone is trying to just create the best hot take so that they can be a little more popular than they were last week. The regime media selects from among those takes, they broadcast them even further, and they focus everyone's attention on those aspects of a story. And as that happens, the deeper understanding of the story is completely missed, and we'll end up talking about things at a surface level, or someone will have a take about how this new story proves these other stories that we've been pushing for a very long time. And of course, you see that with all the woke agendas. Everything is always brought back to how it affects wokeness. Oh, this or that proves that white supremacists are really in control. That's what we'll get from the uniparty left, and then the uniparty right will take a news story, and they'll spend a week on hot takes about how this news story proves that the left's narrative on race is all wrong. And if you've noticed over the last few years, you will see that the uniparty left and right do that with almost every issue. They'll supply super hot takes about how this news story reflects exactly what they've been talking about this whole time when it comes to culture. And they always drag these interesting news stories with all sorts of interesting details that connect the news story to a bunch of different stories, all of which are also interesting, all of which, if illuminated, could teach us interesting things about how the world actually works. But we don't do that. Instead, we think about how this is going to affect this party or that party's chances in the next election, or how this might have something to do with racism or gender ideology. And think about how valuable that is from a global regime perspective. The people will not learn all the details of any of these stories. They will not learn anything new about the corruption of the regime or the tactics through which they hide the obvious from everyone, like distracting them constantly with the same divisive stories that take all their attention, so they never pay attention to what's actually going on. And in that, you can immediately see why certain YouTube shows are so big. The narratives about racism and also anti-racism are so big. The wokeness and the anti-wokeness are so big. It's why the Daily Wire can offer Steven Crowder $35 million and Steven Crowder can turn it down. The regime doesn't care about your individual political ideology or that you might spread it to other people. The regime is happy to incentivize that as long as you keep people attached to the central narrative and focused on the controlled opposition paradigms they've set up, rather than focused on the details that might actually expose what the regime is doing. The hot takes can be fun. Sometimes they're kind of entertaining, but you don't really learn anything, and you don't really end up understanding anything, even over the long term, because the hot takes, first of all, usually are not correct. But when you're engaging with what's happening in the world in that way, you move from subject to subject to subject without having an opportunity to learn anything. And because they move off subjects so quickly, people are inclined to believe whatever it is they heard first, whatever received the most attention, and they end up unlikely to change their views in the future, even if they are presented with new information, because they already spent time blasting out their clueless hot take, and they don't want to seem like they were wrong before. And of course, I'm not saying there's no place for that. When we hear stories out in the public, we tend to have an instant reaction, and then we have a more long-term considered reaction. Sometimes stories are so big and dramatic that they're sucking all the oxygen out of the room, and everyone is weighing in on the one thing. But that doesn't mean we should focus all our energy on interfacing with culture in that manner. It's great for farming attention if you are a professional attention farmer, like the media figures on the uniparty right and left and all of the influencers on legacy social media. They're attention farmers. Their job is to go out there in the morning to the fields of the internet and start planting little seeds, seeing what will grow and capture everyone's attention. Think about the Krasensteins of the world, or the Ian Miles Chongs of the world, or the celebrities and Instagram influencers and fashion bloggers. These are people who hold an outsized position in the public conversation without actually ever doing any research or adding new information to the public debate. They don't help people figure out what's going on. They figure out where they should stand relative to what's going on. And if you're a really crafty attention farmer, you figure out how to position yourself relative to what's going on in a way that draws the most attention, good and bad, from both sides. And if you want to seem really smart and really objective, if you want to brand yourself as the straight shooter, well, then you're going to tell your own side, in quotes, what they're getting wrong sometimes. This is the sort of thing Bill Maher does. And it's the sort of thing Con Inc. has always done. And they've been getting pretty exposed for that, to be fair, throughout the days of Trump since 2015. Because what they used to do, they used to tell, quote unquote, their own side that they were getting it wrong, but they would always be referring to the populists getting it wrong, the nationalists getting it wrong. As long as you define the sides as Democrat, Republican, left, right, blue, red, and not the global regime versus America and the American people, then you could paint a picture of being objective and telling your own side that it's wrong when you're really just supporting the system of power by telling the people that they're wrong, even the ones who, like you, have a little R next to their name. Oh, it's very objective. They are such straight shooters. But the point is, I never wanted to be a hot take guy. And the good thing about getting to a story a few days after people already tried to tackle it is that more information has come out. And now, rather than giving instant reactions like, ooh, see, Democrats are corrupt, we can take a more wide-angle lens approach to the story and see what might actually be going on, what might be falling through the cracks in all of the hot take reactions to the central narrative. So let's get into this Bob Menendez story. And let's go to the very center of the central narrative and start with the New York Times. This is their story from Friday, the 22nd. Menendez accused of brazen bribery plot, taking cash and gold. And before we get into the article, it's worth noting that they're using the word brazen here, which basically means he did it shamelessly, like just right out in public. You can't even believe how blatant he was about his bribery. It's just out there for everyone to see. Now, what does that communicate from the perspective of the New York Times? It kind of makes it sound like he must be guilty. No one could be so blatant about their bribery. It couldn't possibly be so obvious unless the person was actually guilty. But let's remember, this is how they presented Donald Trump waving around national security documents to a journalist, just committing espionage right there on camera, flaunting his own classified documents. Like, see, I really am president. Look at the documents I'm able to flaunt. And I'm pointing out that framing for a reason that will become clear later. It seems like they want the public to believe that this Democrat senator really is guilty, which is not the media's normal approach. They have defended Joe Biden from blatant and obvious brazen corruption for years now. We're consistently told that they're defending Biden because he's a Democrat. They defend the Democrats, you see. But Bob Menendez is a Democrat, and they're not trying to defend Bob Menendez, which means it certainly isn't about the Democrat versus Republican dynamic here, which means it's not true in every instance that the media's goal is to defend Democrats and punish Republicans. And once we know that's what they don't always do, then we need to examine each individual case and try to figure out if that's what they're doing. But that's not the narrative that we're meant to accept. The narrative that we're meant to accept is that the media protects Democrats. At least that's what the mainstream media does. The conservative media like Fox and The Blaze and The Daily Wire, they're biased. They protect Republicans. Except they don't protect Republicans when it's Republicans the regime doesn't like all of the MAGA Republicans. So the dynamic doesn't really apply there either, does it? The regime media protects the interests of the regime, and they don't really care about the individual characters involved, nor the little R or D next to that character's name. Their interest is in promoting the agenda of the regime. To the New York Times. Robert Menendez of New Jersey, the Democratic chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, was charged on Friday with taking hundreds of thousands of dollars in bribes, including bars of gold bullion, to wield his power abroad and at home. The 3-count federal indictment depicted a brazen plan hatched during furtive dinners, in text messages, and on encrypted calls, much of it aimed at increasing U.S. assistance to Egypt and aiding businessmen in New Jersey. Mr. Menendez's wife, Nadine Menendez, is accused of acting as a go-between, passing messages to an American-Egyptian businessman, Wael Hana, who maintained close connections with Egyptian military and intelligence officials, the indictment said. In one text to an Egyptian general, Mr. Hana referred to the senator who held sway over military sales, financing, and other aid as, quote, our man. Mr. Menendez, in a strongly worded rebuke to prosecutors, said that he was confident the matter would be successfully resolved once all of the facts are presented. Friday's charges described an intermingling of the bare-knuckle backroom dealings of Mr. Menendez's home state of New Jersey, and delicate matters of security in the Middle East. They represent the latest episode in a decades-long political career that took Mr. Menendez, the son of Cuban immigrants, from the Union City, New Jersey school board to the halls of the Senate, a career marked by accusations of corruption and an earlier federal indictment that ended in a hung jury. The new charges threaten Menendez's vast political power as well as his freedom. Governor Philip D. Murphy of New Jersey, a close Democratic ally, called on Menendez to resign, an admonition that unleashed a torrent of similar messages from political leaders throughout the state. Mr. Menendez insisted that he would not heed them. "I'm not going anywhere," he said in a statement Friday evening. Now, Governor Phil Murphy, Democrat, chosen by the regime, very, very powerful governor in New Jersey, implemented the entire COVID agenda and was then helped in his re-election effort by being granted overtime by the regime. It was too close to call between Phil Murphy, the authoritarian governor of New Jersey, who was roundly loathed and hated by his own constituents. And he eventually won in overtime on the same night that Glenn Youngkin flipped the once deep blue Virginia and made it a red state once again. Glenn Youngkin was proof that elections were not stolen. They could be won with the right candidate and the right issues at the right time, just like they've always told us. And then we saw Phil Murphy have to use overtime election tactics to beat a guy that virtually no one ever heard of. So Phil Murphy, key regime figure, immediately came out saying Menendez should resign. Immediately. Mr. Menendez did send a letter to Chuck Schumer of New York, the Senate Majority Leader, informing him that he was stepping down as chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee, as required by the rules the Senate Democrats adopted to govern themselves. Isn't that incredible? They could get rid of a committee chairman as long as that committee chairman was indicted. The Democrats are so incorruptible that they put very strict rules in place to deal with anyone who is accused of corruption. They are the least corrupt people ever. That is why they're immediately stripping all the power away from Robert Menendez. The Democrat Communist Party does not tolerate that kind of corruption. I mean, yes, they will vote for it. They will intentionally install exactly that kind of corruption in the office of fake president. And they will steal elections for people who are clearly far more corrupt than Robert Menendez. But also, they won't tolerate this kind of corruption, not in the Senate. So we're going to have to remove Bob Menendez from the Foreign Relations Committee and replace him with someone else. And we'll just keep that little tidbit in mind as well. The corruption scheme, according to the indictment, extended beyond foreign aid. Mr. Menendez is accused of using his position to influence criminal investigations of two other New Jersey businessmen, one of whom was a longtime fundraiser for Mr. Menendez. Well, that sounds very bad. Toward that end, the senator recommended that President Biden nominate a lawyer, Philip Selinger, to be U.S. Attorney for New Jersey because Mr. Menendez believed he could influence Mr. Selinger's prosecution of the fundraiser, the indictment said. Mr. Selinger, who was ultimately confirmed for the post, did not bend, prosecutors said. Now that's a pretty interesting framing, is it not? Does this sound like it is possible? The corrupt Mr. Menendez nominated this lawyer, Selinger, to be a U.S. attorney. And this article is suggesting that Menendez nominated this fellow in order to influence this fellow in his dealings with this Menendez fundraiser. The lawyer Selinger was confirmed and then did not help the Menendez fundraiser. But we're supposed to believe that Menendez still nominated him for corrupt reasons. He was confirmed and didn't help Menendez, but Menendez was corrupt and trying to be corrupt by nominating him. That does not make sense. Mr. Menendez is also accused of meddling in an investigation by the New Jersey Attorney General's office using advice and pressure. in an attempt to persuade a senior prosecutor to go easy in the case of two associates of a man who gave Mr. Menendez a Mercedes-Benz convertible. The prosecutor considered Mr. Menendez's actions, quote, inappropriate and did not agree to intervene, end quote, according to the indictment. In exchange for all those actions, the indictment said, the senator and his wife accepted cash, gold, payments toward a home mortgage, the luxury car, and other valuable things. The day after a trip to Egypt in 2021, the indictment said, Mr. Menendez asked in an internet query, how much is 1 kilo of gold worth? Here is Damian Williams, U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York, announcing the Menendez charges. And this clip is about 5 minutes. I'm going to play all 5 minutes. If you don't like 5-minute clips, go skip ahead.
My name is Damian Williams, and I'm the United States Attorney here in the Southern District of New York. Today I'm announcing that my office has obtained a 3-count indictment charging Senator Robert Menendez, his wife Nadine Menendez, and 3 New Jersey businessmen, Wael Hannah, Jose Uribe, and Fred Davies, for bribery offenses. The investigation that led to these charges has been run out of the Southern District of New York. The indictment alleges that between 2018 and 2022, Senator Menendez, the senior U.S. Senator from New Jersey and the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and his wife Nadine Menendez, engaged in a corrupt relationship with Hannah, Uribe, and Davies. The indictment alleges that through that relationship, the senator and his wife accepted hundreds of thousands of dollars of bribes in exchange for Senator Menendez using his power and influence to protect and to enrich those businessmen and to benefit the government of Egypt. The indictment alleges that Hannah, Uribe, and Davies provided bribes in the form of cash, gold, home mortgage payments, a low-show or a no-show job for Nadine Menendez, a Mercedes-Benz, and other things of value to the senator and his wife. Now, constituent service is part of any legislator's job. Senator Menendez is no different. And as we explain in the indictment, there are things that Senator Menendez says he can do for his constituents and things that he says he cannot do for his constituents. He put it all on his Senate website. So for instance, it says he cannot compel an agency to act in someone's favor. It says he cannot influence matters involving a private business. It says he cannot get involved in criminal matters or cases, period. But we allege that behind the scenes, Senator Menendez was doing those things for certain people, the people who were bribing him and his wife. Now let me say a little bit more about the conduct that's alleged in the indictment. The indictment alleges that Senator Menendez took several actions as part of this corrupt relationship. First, the indictment alleges that Senator Menendez used his power and influence, including his leadership role on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, to benefit the government of Egypt in various ways. Among other actions, Senator Menendez allegedly provided sensitive, non-public U.S. government information to Egyptian officials and otherwise took steps to secretly aid the government of Egypt. We also allege that Senator Menendez improperly pressured a senior official at the U.S. Department of Agriculture to protect a lucrative monopoly that the government of Egypt had awarded to Hannah, a lucrative monopoly that Hannah then used to fund certain bribe payments. Second, the indictment alleges that Senator Menendez used his power and influence to try to disrupt a criminal investigation and prosecution undertaken by the New Jersey Attorney General's office related to an associate and a relative of Uribe. Third, the indictment alleges that Senator Menendez used his power and influence to try to disrupt a federal prosecution of Davies in the District of New Jersey in 2 ways. First, by seeking to install a United States attorney who he thought could be influenced with respect to Davies, and second, by trying to influence that office to act favorably in Davies' case. And as we allege in the indictment, the senator agreed to do these things and use his power in this way because Hannah was paying bribes, because Uribe was paying bribes, and because Davies was paying bribes. Fortunately, the public officials the senator sought to influence did not bend to the pressure. That's a good thing. Now, as part of this investigation, special agents with the FBI executed search warrants on the residence and safe deposit box of Senator Menendez and Nadine Menendez in New Jersey. When they got there, they discovered approximately $500,000 of cash stuffed into envelopes and closets. Some of the cash was stuffed in the senator's jacket pockets. Some of the envelopes of cash contained Davies' fingerprints or Davies' DNA. That's not all. Agents also discovered a lot of gold that was provided by Davies and Hannah. And the FBI, of course, found the Mercedes-Benz that Uribe had provided them. Now, the items that the FBI uncovered are discussed in the indictment, which I encourage all of you to read carefully.
Now that sounds pretty damn corrupt. You hear all of those charges and you think, yep, that sounds exactly like what a corrupt politician would do. That sounds like it's exactly how the system works. Now, do we know it's true just because he has been indicted and there is an indictment that describes all these various crimes? Well, no, we've seen that we cannot simply do that. What we have on the side of the Southern District of New York, of these prosecutors, is an explanation of how they believe that Senator Robert Menendez broke the law, engaging in this corrupt scheme to wield his influence and power in exchange for great sums of money. That's one side of a story with at least two sides and potentially a great many more. And we cannot be sure that any one of those sides will be able to express the full and complete truth. Multiple sides might give us some truth. Even the side intentionally trying to manipulate and mislead us might give us some of the truth. But the truth will not be a matter of choosing whose story is totally correct, which character in the situation is telling the truth. It's a matter of trying to figure out exactly what happened, not trying to judge the truth or falsity of one particular story. So we get the framing of the New York Times, and that article is quite long. It goes on. It describes the details of some of the claims, and we'll get back to the article in a second. But we get the New York Times framing. Then we get the claims directly from the prosecuting U.S. Attorney, Damian Williams of the Southern District of New York. We'll get Menendez's side in a very brief form because, of course, that's going to come out more as time goes on. And then we get into any trial that may eventually happen. But we can understand we may never know the full, real truth. So we're going to get a bunch of parts and then we're going to let them be. And then we're going to watch as reality begins to fill in some of the blanks. In response to the Damian Williams press conference, the Times writes, soon after the news conference, Mr. Menendez issued an angry page-long denunciation of the charges, blaming them on unnamed, quote, forces behind the scenes that have, quote, repeatedly attempted to silence my voice and dig my political grave. Now, normally I would love to just read his one-page memo on this show. I'm going to keep looking for it, but I've spent like 10 or 15 minutes trying to find it, and that has not worked. There was even a link to it in a USA Today article that has now been removed. And I don't know if that means anything. I'm not saying it does. Maybe it means nothing. But it's real easy to find the 39-page indictment and read that. And hey, if one of you wants to go out and search for it and send it to me, that would be awesome. Maybe you can find it in 30 seconds. And hey, you will beat me at researching today. I will applaud you. The excesses of these prosecutors is apparent, he added. They have misrepresented the normal work of a congressional office. On top of that, not content with making false claims against me, they have attacked my wife for the long-standing friendships she had before she and I even met. The lawyer for Mrs. Menendez, David Shurtler, said his client had broken no laws. Mrs. Menendez denies any criminal conduct and will vigorously contest these charges in court, he said. And then they get into all of the dramatic details of each of the individual stories involved in the charges. So let's just skip down toward the end. If you want those details, feel free to read the indictment. Mr. Menendez, his wife, and their 3 co-defendants are expected to appear in Manhattan federal court on Wednesday, according to Nicholas Biase, a spokesman for the Southern District. The charges are not the senator's first encounter with the law. In 2015, Mr. Menendez was indicted in New Jersey on bribery charges in what federal prosecutors called a scheme between the senator and a wealthy eye doctor to trade political favors for gifts worth close to $1 million, including luxury vacations in the Caribbean and campaign contributions. Mr. Menendez's corruption trial ended in a mistrial in November 2017, after the jury said it was unable to reach a verdict. The judge later acquitted Mr. Menendez of several charges, and the Justice Department dismissed the others. Friday's indictment resounded anew in Washington and in New Jersey as members of the party and Congress called for Mr. Menendez to step down. However, Senator Cory Booker of New Jersey, a close ally of Mr. Menendez's, remained silent about the accusations and the calls for resignation. And since then, Cory Booker has decided that Menendez should step down. He really wants his friend Bob Menendez to fight those charges, and he's not sure if Menendez is guilty or not, but he thinks that for the good of everybody, Menendez should step down. And it's important that someone new is always calling for Menendez's resignation. Phil Murphy did it right out of the gate. People continued coming out, calling for his resignation over the weekend, and then yesterday, and then today we get Cory Booker, the other senator from New Jersey, finally weighing in. Go fight those bastards, but also in the meantime, resign so that we can do something else with your Senate seat. Mr. Menendez is already facing at least one Democratic challenger in his planned run for re-election to a 4th Senate term, and the Republican mayor of Mendham Borough, New Jersey, has also announced that she will compete for the seat. If Mr. Menendez were to quit, as Mr. Murphy has suggested, the governor would name a successor. Wait a second. So that would mean that Phil Murphy, who is illegitimate and himself the product of election fraud, as we could all witness with our own eyes on election night back in 2021, as everyone was cheering on Governor Glenn Youngkin as he showed the power of being anti-woke and convinced Republicans that our elections are very safe and very secure because, see, a Republican can win. And let's just take a moment and think about the most popular Republican governors right now, according to the establishment, and who they have faced in their past few elections. Because Glenn Youngkin, well, he faced off against a guy named Terry McAuliffe, an old school Clinton hack who has already been governor of Virginia. They didn't really support him. They didn't try to create a new rising Democratic star. They just tried to hand it over to Terry McAuliffe. Why? Because they can raise Terry McAuliffe's profile, they can get Terry McAuliffe paid, and they know the seat's going to Youngkin anyway, because that's what the regime agenda called for. Then you've got Ron DeSantis facing a Terry McAuliffe clone in Charlie Crist in the last midterm in 2022. The candidate he faced before that was a prospective Democrat rising star named Andrew Gillum. In fact, even Donald Trump mentioned this last week in one of those interviews. Andrew Gillum was basically the parallel in Florida to Stacey Abrams. And interestingly enough, Stacey Abrams has been the candidate facing off against Brian Kemp twice now. And the white male version of Stacey Abrams, who happens to be only half her size, Beto O'Rourke, faced off against Governor Greg Abbott. So we have two hapless has-beens being run by Democrats in races where the establishment Republican would win. And then we have two hapless pretend rising stars, media creations in Stacey Abrams and Beto O'Rourke going against establishment Republican governors Brian Kemp and Greg Abbott. When you strip the R and the D out of the equation and just look at what is actually happening, knowing that these aren't legitimate elections, they're just selections, You can just see the narrative that the regime is pushing and trying to push. And then once you are able to become aware of that, you can think about why the regime needs that person and that particular narrative. And as I have suggested before and gone into in a pretty lengthy discussion, I believe the Trump endorsement is Trump's influence on the public narrative and the reported result of the election. Because ultimately, the result as reported exists to enhance the narrative we already understand and the one they mean to keep projecting into the future. They will tell us what voters do, then they tell us what voters did, and then they tell us that voters did it for a certain reason. This is what voters think now, and then they push that ahead in the narrative. And as we wake up, we realize that they are not telling us the truth about what voters think and about what voters care about and about why voters do what they do and about the results of the election, of course. There is actually no point at which they care about what voters are actually thinking or doing. But back to Phil Murphy, who is illegitimate, who won a real squeaker in overtime on the same night that Glenn Youngkin turned a Biden plus 10 state in 2020 into a Youngkin plus 2 state just a year later. A 12-point swing in now deep blue Virginia, but Governor Phil Murphy, one of the most powerful and popular Democrats in the country, one of the most powerful Democrat governors in the country, Phil Murphy of New Jersey, he was only able to squeak one out over a candidate no one ever heard of, a candidate who, by the way, did not receive Donald Trump's endorsement. And the media remarked about how strange that was back then because, of course, Donald Trump's Bedminster Golf Club is in New Jersey. But let's return from our little tangent on the illegitimacy of these governors and how the election process works to the New York Times dropping a bomb on us in the third sentence from the end here. If Mr. Menendez were to quit, as Mr. Murphy has suggested, the governor would name a successor. These are serious charges that implicate national security and the integrity of our criminal justice system, Mr. Murphy said in a statement. The alleged facts are so serious, he added, that they compromise the ability of Senator Menendez to effectively represent the people of our state. Okay, so that's his justification. But the point here is Phil Murphy would name that successor. And then what happens if he names that successor a year before that election? Well, that successor immediately becomes a national figure. We're going to talk about that person for a few weeks. They're going to display that person as the new Democratic hope in New Jersey. You can imagine it would be a quote unquote person of color, which is so much different than a colored person. You see, saying colored people is racist, but saying people of color is anti-racist. And anti-racist, of course, is the exact same thing as racism, except it's done by good people. We would probably have a person of color who we would then be told is going to be taken under Cory Booker's wing. It would be the perfect time for the Democrats to create a new media darling, a star. All of that would be part of a free campaign, and the intent would be to convince the general public that the Democrats are serious about corruption, tough on corruption. Even if it costs them a Senate seat for a little while, they will dispose of a powerful senator on the Foreign Relations Committee because they just don't tolerate this kind of thing, which is why they're prosecuting Donald Trump, because they say he's corrupt. I mean, they have no proof of his corruption at all. Even though they've tried to create it for 8 straight years, there's nothing there, and they haven't given anyone a reason to believe there might be. But they have said plenty of times that there was proof of that Donald Trump actually is one of the most corrupt people ever to hold office. They take corruption seriously. They won't allow it from Trump, and they won't even allow it when it's one of their own, Robert Menendez. Take him out, the illegitimate Phil Murphy will replace him with a new Democrat rising star, and that person will be running as an incumbent. The Democrat Party can put their candidate in place and forget about that whole primary process. Why would they want to have a primary that they don't have to have? Are they really going to run a Democrat challenger against Menendez? Well, then you would have two Democrats actually arguing about Democrat things, and that can't help the central narrative. They don't want anyone to argue about the central narrative ever, not in public. The regime could simply steal that Senate seat for the Democrats once again. This new star in place. The justification is this new star is a new star and now an incumbent. So she has, or he has, or they has the power of the incumbency in their next race. It makes sense that they won in deep blue New Jersey. So they have that narrative going for them. And as always, they want to kill multiple birds with one stone. So there are other narratives being set up as well. But let's stay on this one for a second and deal with this Republican mayor from Mendham Borough in Morris County, New Jersey. This is Politico from 8 days ago, a few days before the Menendez indictment. New Jersey mayor with ties to Trump announces campaign to take on Bob Menendez. Christine Serrano-Glasner, a New Jersey mayor who has political ties to former President Donald Trump, on Monday announced her campaign for the Republican 2024 U.S. Senate nomination. Serrano-Glasner, the mayor of Mendham Borough in Morris County, hopes to challenge 18-year incumbent Democrat Bob Menendez, who's facing his third federal investigation since entering the Senate in 2006. Senator Menendez has been in politics his entire life. He's under investigation yet again, Glasner says in a campaign kickoff video. New Jersey deserves someone with integrity, someone who will work hard to tackle the tough problems that are facing all of us, someone who will put us first, someone who cares more about our families, our New Jersey families, than his cronies. Republicans haven't won a U.S. Senate election in New Jersey since 1972. Oh, so deep, so blue. Though some state Democrats are nervous that the latest federal investigation, which involves probing how an Edgewater-based company got an exclusive government contract in Egypt to certify halal meat, will endanger Menendez's re-election prospects. Menendez has said he intends to seek re-election, and most state Democrats appear to be backing him. That could change if he faces charges. And as Politico so insightfully predicted, yes, the New Jersey Democrats have called for him to resign. They are no longer appearing to back him. But Serrano-Glasner's ties to Trump could also be a political vulnerability in New Jersey, where Trump backlash helped Menendez coast to an 11-point victory over Republican Bob Hugin in 2018, even though Menendez had just survived a corruption trial after the jury deadlocked. Oh yes, New Jersey just hates Donald Trump and loves Phil Murphy. Serrano-Glasner is a principal and co-founder of C&M Transcontinental, a public affairs firm. Her husband, Michael Glasner, is the firm's president. Michael Glasner served as chief operating officer and deputy campaign manager for Trump from July 2015 until November 2020. He is currently leading a Trump legal defense fund, according to reports. Oh, reports. They're always right. Menendez advisor Michael Solomon seized on the Trump ties in a statement. Here's the thing that New Jersey's voters will quickly learn. The mayor is a hardcore, unapologetic Trump supporter. Even after Trump pushed an insurrection, even after he bragged about helping to end Roe versus Wade, and even after he cozies up to Vladimir Putin, Mayor Serrano-Glasner is all in on Trump. She is clearly out of touch with New Jerseyans. Bob Menendez knows New Jersey. His record of achievement and advocacy for our state is simply unmatched. Oh, sure it is. It is amazing that they are still going with this messaging. I hope they never ever stop. Keep talking about the very violent insurrection. Keep talking about Trump bragging about helping to end Roe versus Wade. Keep talking about Vladimir Putin. Keep talking about all of it. The idea that the American public is on the Democrat side about any of that stuff is absolutely preposterous. Now, if those reports are correct and we take all this at surface value, that seems like the Trump campaign, Donald Trump himself perhaps, has a relationship with the Glasners, And if that's the case, then this woman, Christine Serrano-Glasner, may get a Trump endorsement in her race for this Senate seat in New Jersey. And if Bob Menendez survives this little fight for long enough, then Serrano-Glasner will be facing a Bob Menendez who the public believes is corrupt and still somehow ended up with the nomination from the Democrats. And who does that sound like? Well, that sounds exactly like Joe Biden. The entire public knows Joe Biden is corrupt, and Joe Biden still may very well be the Democrat nominee for president next year. And Democrats are going to have to tell a story about how Joe Biden's not really corrupt and about how Americans really do want Joe Biden to be president again. Now, again, they're trying to get rid of Joe Biden. And as I've been saying for a long time, they're trying to create that Gavin Newsom versus Ron DeSantis matchup. They're trying to convince the uniparty left supporters and the uniparty right supporters that these are their new champions, and they're going to go off in a perfect controlled opposition paradigm, and we will have a normie battle royale. The regime would absolutely love that. They're even planning to stage a debate between these two idiots that is going to be hosted by Sean Hannity. We'll see if anyone cares enough to watch it. And with Ron's debate performance against a literal punching bag, they gave him Charlie Crist so that Ron could easily win. And he still underperformed in that debate. And we know how poorly the Republican primary debate, in quotes, went a few weeks ago. They're going to do another one of them, by the way, tomorrow night. But the Newsom versus DeSantis thing isn't going to work one way or another. It's just not going to work. And they will likely be left with Joe Biden, a candidate everyone knows is corrupt, and it is going to be very hard to convince the American public that they actually voted for Joe Biden in a free and fair election. And we will likely be seeing the same dynamic playing out on a smaller scale in the Senate race in New Jersey. The regime seems to be trying to get rid of Menendez, and they're just not going to be able to. Obviously, we'll see. Maybe they'll put enough pressure on Bob Menendez to get him out of there. But I think he's probably going to be around, and they're going to have a very damaged candidate as the Democrat nominee for senator from New Jersey next year. Now, again, surface level interpretation. All of this assumes that our elections are real in some sense and that this is going to be a normal election cycle. I don't believe that's true, but we have to look at everything two ways. We're going to take that surface level normie approach. We want to understand the story there, and then we want to understand what's actually happening behind that. We'll see what we learn about this Christine Serrano-Glasner woman. There are plenty of people who were associated with Trump, some for years like the Glasners, who are nonetheless on the side of the regime in their attempt to take down Donald Trump. We see that all over the Ron DeSantis op. And considering that it looks like they're trying to take out Menendez, and by they I mean the Democrats in this situation, the regime, and replace him with a newer, better Democrat, as they are with Gavin Newsom, it's at least worth considering that they're trying to choose who the other contestant in New Jersey will be the same way they are with Ron DeSantis. And so we have to have our eyes open and see whether this Glasner lady is exactly that. We cannot assume that she is America first, that she is MAGA, just because her husband worked for the Trump campaign for a while and now is reported to be leading a Trump legal defense fund. Politico telling me that someone has ties to Donald Trump, that's not enough to convince me that that person is America first. So it's a big political advantage potentially for the Democrats to be able to move Robert Menendez out of the picture, find a hand-picked new Democrat that Phil Murphy will appoint. That Democrat will take on the role of incumbent in the election next year. And when the regime steals it for that Democrat, they will be able to say that New Jersey remains deep blue. And then we can celebrate the Democrats in all their honor, being willing to remove the corrupt member of their own party, even if it costs them an election, and their focus on principles and their focus on the people of New Jersey is what guided them to a Democrat victory with this rising young star who goes right under Cory Booker's wing. And they look so great for doing it. Let's get some more Democrat reaction. This is from the Los Angeles Times today. Column, Republicans take heed. Democrats show how to deal with rotten apple in their midst. What a narrative we have emerging. The Democrats are the party who's going to go after corruption, even if it's one of their own, except if it's Joe Biden or absolutely anybody else other than Senator Robert Menendez. And there are some reactions in here. One from Shifty Adam Schiff. The allegations in the indictment of Senator Menendez are shocking, he wrote on Twitter. If accurate, they represent the most profound betrayal of his oath of office. He's entitled to the presumption of innocence and will have his day in court, but the gravity of the matter demands his resignation. So even if he's innocent, just the level of the accusations means that he must go, according to Adam Schiff. Now, Adam Schiff lied to the world about Russian collusion for years. He said that he had special information that he had been given in the House Select Committee on Intelligence. And while he couldn't go into details, there was absolutely damning evidence that proved Donald Trump colluded with Russia and that the entire Russian collusion hoax was true. Of course, now we know it's not true. He also went out there and read into the congressional record in the lead up to an impeachment of a duly elected president a fake transcript of a phone call between Trump and Volodymyr Zelensky, as we discussed yesterday. Talk about brazen. What Adam Schiff has done in public on television is far more serious than anything in that Menendez indictment, even if we assume that every word of it is true. Cory Booker is now saying that Menendez should resign. He says the details of the allegations are of such a nature that the faith and trust of New Jerseyans, as well as those he must work with in order to be effective, have been shaken to the core. I believe stepping down is best for those Senator Menendez has spent his life serving. This article in the LA Times actually makes the point I was just making, quite brazenly, I might add. This is columnist Mark Barabak. He writes, from a cynical viewpoint, it's easy to see why Democrats feel free to express outrage and cast the senator aside. They get a free pass. Murphy, after all, would surely exercise his power as governor and replace Menendez with another Democrat, thus maintaining the party's control of the chamber. Removing Menendez would also eliminate the possibility of putting his seat in play in 2024 when Democrats face a stiff challenge keeping their tenuous majority, and reduce the risk of him dragging down Democrats in New Jersey's legislative contest this fall. So they understand that Menendez would be weakened by these charges. It would make his political campaign next year that much more difficult. And by difficult, I mean difficult to explain for the regime how that candidate could have still won. If Menendez steps down, the whole thing goes away. Normal Americans are not going to pay attention to the news to figure out what it is that Robert Menendez actually did. They're going to ignore the entire thing if he steps down. If he's out of the news, it's all gone. No one will care about Menendez's corruption. No one will even look into it. They won't find out if other Democrats are as corrupt, if other Democrats were involved in the same scheme or similar schemes. It'll all just go away. And who looks good when it all goes away? Well, all the other Democrats, because they are so incorruptible themselves. They are so anti-corruption. They would never allow for corruption. And that's why they have demanded that a senator on their own side will step down. It's not a political chess match. It's really just all about them having deeply held principles that they just can't help but express all the time, even when it might hurt their party. Donald Trump created quite a stir with his response. He wrote on Sunday, Senate Democrats should all resign based on Senator Bob Menendez. They all knew what was going on and the way he lived. Why doesn't the FBI raid Senate Democrats' homes like they illegally raided Mar-a-Lago, where nothing was done wrong based on the Presidential Records Act? Menendez is a, quote, piker compared to some of those election-stealing thugs. Can you imagine how much crooked Joe Biden has stolen and what's in some of his many homes? The FBI and, quote, justice notified him that they would be going in to look, quote, in a few weeks. In other words, get rid of the cash, gold, and documents ASAP before we get there. They didn't give me any warning. They just showed up. Hunter lived with Crooked Joe in Delaware. It would be a, quote, treasure hunt. Crooked's coffers must be loaded up with cash. I wonder how much they got paid for rigging the election. Menendez is one of many, a small timer at that. Every Democrat should resign from the Senate. Our borders are broken. Our elections are rigged. MAGA. And it's hard to argue with that. I don't know if the accusations the Southern District of New York has made against Robert Menendez are true or not. I certainly would never give Menendez the benefit of the doubt because it's pretty clear that pretty much every politician who serves the uniparty in Washington is deeply corrupt and has a history of corruption. And you also have to remember that corruption and compromise are the means by which these politicians are controlled and controllable. The corruption isn't a secret, it's known about. This is the power they wield over the politician. The politician has to do what he's told, or else the corruption will be exposed and the politician will be taken out of office or maybe imprisoned. That's how it works with the compromising material as well. A lot of these people have reprehensible personal lives. Or if not, perhaps they've made mistakes in their past that they do not want the public to know about. They do not want their wife, for instance, to know about, and then they are controllable. Someone has information that could destroy their life, destroy their marriage, destroy their home, destroy their career, and the politician will do what they are told under threat of that stuff coming out. Does each and every politician have this? Perhaps not. But we should assume that if they're serving the uniparty, then they very likely do. We have public officials who are in office forever and become incredibly rich while in office. It's not from their salary. So there's no reason to suspect that Robert Menendez, of all people, was actually totally clean and a straight shooter. Every bit of the indictment could be true. And as Trump said, it could still only be a minor example of what really goes on in Congress. If the people calling for Menendez's resignation really believe that he should resign on principle because of his corruption, and that's the new standard for someone resigning, then they too should all resign because they are even more corrupt than Menendez is. That's not hard to believe at all. And considering how many of them are involved with election theft, which is a crime against this nation, is it treason? It may well be treason. Getting a few gold bars from some Egyptians sounds pretty minor. And by the way, Menendez, for his part, he held a press conference on Monday to address some of these issues. And he actually said that the cash that he was holding was actually legally withdrawn from his own savings account, and that he holds cash like that because his family was subject to confiscation in Cuba. He said, it's old-fashioned, but the money was drawn from my personal savings account. And again, I have no reason to defend Menendez, and I'm even happy to assume that all of the accusations, or most of the accusations, are true, that Menendez really is corrupt, and still point out it's probably not a good thing for us to accept the idea and the framing that if someone has gold bars and cash in their house, that they are probably corrupt. I don't think we want to embrace the notion that keeping some of our assets outside of the banking system is a bad idea and would somehow imply criminality. Now let's get into some of the other stuff that's floating around, some of the stuff that's a little more below the surface, but has an impact on other things that we are seeing in the world right now. And here's the first little wrinkle. Now, this is not Menendez's first time dealing with charges of corruption. The last time was during Trump's term. And a very strange thing happened during that period. There is a quote-unquote prank phone call from Stuttering John of the Howard Stern Show, pretending to be Robert Menendez calling Donald Trump. And Donald Trump had this phone call while on Air Force One, we are told.
Hi, Bob.
Hey, how are you?
How are you? Congratulations on everything. We're proud of you. Congratulations. Great job. You went through a tough situation, and I don't think a very fair situation.
That there was actually a prank call. Comedian John Melendez, also known to fans of Howard Stern as Stuttering John, says he pretended to be Democratic Senator Bob Menendez, and he called the White House and eventually got to speak with President Trump on Air Force One. The comedian, who's a regular on the Stern Show, as I said, says that's President Trump congratulating who he thought was the senator for his corruption charges having been cleared up earlier this year.
So this is Donald Trump on this prank phone call, supposedly congratulating Senator Menendez for beating his prior corruption charges. Now, assuming this is authentic, and we can assume it's authentic, it probably is, and for the sake of discussion, let's just go on ahead assuming that it is. But once we assume it's authentic, then we have to immediately react. And of course, the DeSantis simps out there said this was proof that Donald Trump is just a Democrat. He's not a real conservative. He's tricking everybody. How could he possibly congratulate this corrupt senator? Blah, blah, blah. All of that is very important. This 10-second phone call could not mean anything other than their surface level interpretation that once again confirms for them that Donald Trump and, of course, all his supporters are worthy targets of their hatred. This further proves that Donald Trump can't be trusted. He has no idea what's going on. He is easily tricked, and he's also kissing some Democrats' ass about getting off from these charges. And that is the story they want everybody to believe. They are dunking on Donald Trump. How could he do this? Remember this back then. See, the man really is corrupt, and Donald Trump was supporting a corrupt Democrat. How could he? The uniparty right is once again mad at Donald Trump. But strangely, the uniparty left didn't give Donald Trump credit for supporting Robert Menendez. So apparently Donald Trump wasn't actually aligned with the uniparty left, even though the uniparty right is telling you that he is. That's so strange. The uniparty right is saying Donald Trump is aligned with the uniparty left, and the uniparty left doesn't believe that Donald Trump is. What an odd dynamic. It's almost like the uniparty left and uniparty right are totally aligned in figuring out how everything Donald Trump does is bad for them. Now, why don't we give him the benefit of the doubt and say that everything Donald Trump does is bad for them? Well, that would indicate that they are, in fact, just two halves of a controlled opposition dynamic within the uniparty. The uniparty left and the uniparty right working together, always hating Donald Trump and accusing him of being too much like the other guys in the controlled opposition dynamic. It's amazing, isn't it? We have a prank phone call that we're assuming is real. Donald Trump gives support to Bob Menendez for beating these corruption charges. And we're being told by the uniparty right it's very bad. The uniparty left does not come to Donald Trump's defense and thank him. They don't go out and say, even Donald Trump understands that Robert Menendez was never guilty. And we see virtually the same dynamic emerging now. So these Donald Trump comments got out through a comedian and were delivered in a story about how Donald Trump, the big dummy, got tricked again. But if we strip away all the judgment and politics and drama, if that is all removed from the situation, then the only thing we were actually communicated was Donald Trump, for some reason, thinks it's good that Robert Menendez beat these charges. And we are given explanations for that. We are told it's because Donald Trump is reckless and stupid and he's willing to kiss the ass of whoever is willing to help empower him. And he's happy to do that with the Democrats because in so many ways, we are told by the DeSantis simps, Donald Trump is actually a Democrat. That's who Donald Trump is. He's beating the establishment Republicans by so much so that he can be the nominee who then loses to the Democrats just as they want, even though he's beating them now by 10 points as well. The uniparty right and the uniparty left are very, very dumb. They could have simply realized that these tactics don't work anymore. And they could have realized this years ago, but they haven't, and they just keep going. But let's consider for a second that Donald Trump actually was happy that Menendez beat these charges. Well, let's find out more about what was going on back then. And let's start with this article in The Atlantic from Friday by David A. Graham. Bob Menendez never should have been senator this long in the first place. In a court of law, defendants are entitled to a presumption of innocence. In the court of public opinion, Senator Bob Menendez enjoys no such indulgence. The Democrat from New Jersey was indicted today, along with his wife Nadine and 3 others, on 3 counts of corruption. Federal prosecutors say the group accepted hundreds of thousands of dollars of bribes to assist the Egyptian government. Among other allegations, they say Menendez gave sensitive U.S. government information to the Egyptians and tried to shield 2 of the defendants from prosecution. This isn't the first federal corruption case against Menendez, and his continued representation of his state in the Senate and as head of the powerful Foreign Relations Committee, at least up until today, Menendez stepped down from the chairmanship after his indictment, are a testimony to the pusillanimity of Democrats. The news also shows how the heated partisanship of the current era can keep bad politicians in office for fear of helping the other party. The indictment includes claims that New York, the magazine, accurately characterizes as cartoonish. In Menendez's closet, FBI agents found envelopes full of cash in the pockets of jackets that had Menendez's name sewn on them. They also turned up more than $100,000 worth of gold bars, like in some sort of harebrained Yosemite Sam scheme. For good measure, the bars are stamped Swiss Bank Corporation. Prosecutors also cite texts from Nadine to Bob Menendez, complaining that a co-defendant, Wael Hana, had not paid the bribes he'd promised. And prosecutors allege the senator agreed to derail a prosecution in exchange for a Mercedes C300 convertible. The document is, perhaps needless to say, a compelling read. If corruption allegations against Bob Menendez sound familiar, that's not just because you're familiar with the recent history of other Democratic senators from New Jersey. In 2015, Menendez was indicted by federal prosecutors for a sweeping bribery scheme alongside a doctor named Salmon Melgen. The evidence against Menendez seemed compelling, but he got a lucky break. In the midst of his trial, the U.S. Supreme Court threw out a corruption conviction of former Virginia Governor Bob McDonnell, a Republican decision that, Matt Ford wrote, fundamentally changed the standard for bribery. The jury hung, the Justice Department dismissed charges, and Menendez got off with a severe admonition from the Senate Ethics Committee. Melgen was later convicted and sentenced to 17 years in prison for Medicare fraud. Donald Trump commuted his sentence in one of his last acts as president, crediting Melgen's, quote, generosity in treating all patients, especially those unable to pay or unable to afford health care insurance, end quote, on your dime. So Menendez was indicted alongside a doctor who was convicted and sentenced to 17 years, and then Donald Trump commuted that sentence. And we'll talk about that in just a second. But let's first recognize the case that was just cited here. In the midst of his trial, this is the Menendez trial, the U.S. Supreme Court threw out a corruption conviction of former Virginia Governor Bob McDonnell, a Republican, a decision that, Matt Ford wrote, fundamentally changed the standard for bribery. And we'll get to that in a second too. But let's first recognize that this thrown-out conviction for corruption by former Virginia Governor Bob McDonnell, that's the overturned verdict that everyone always talks about, achieved by prosecutor Jack Smith, the special counsel who's bringing all of those indictments against President Donald J. Trump. Those very, very real indictments. Donald Trump is, in fact, so indicted by Jack Smith. Jack Smith is actually now seeking a gag order, and Trump filed today in opposition to that. He continues to call Jack Smith a sociopath and a deranged lunatic and things like that. The overturning of this McDonnell conviction is what got Jack Smith sent over to Europe so that he could go help out the globalists at The Hague. Graham at The Atlantic includes more of Menendez's statement from last week, adding, since this investigation was leaked nearly a year ago, there has been an active smear campaign of anonymous sources and innuendos to create an air of impropriety where none exists. The excesses of these prosecutors is apparent. He added, those behind this campaign see me as an obstacle in the way of their broader political goals. Graham writes, that sounds a lot like Trump's, quote, I'm being indicted for you. and his claims that he's the target of retribution by the, quote, deep state. And before we switch gears here, it's worth just taking this in. This is David Graham enforcing the Democrat-Republican paradigm in order to explain away something that you cannot explain away when you realize that that controlled opposition paradigm is totally irrelevant. Graham writes, Menendez's protests are hard to take seriously, given that New Jersey is run by Democrats and the president is a Democrat, adding that Menendez is not a close pal of Biden's. Graham goes on, but voicing these arguments could help validate Trump's defense against his own indictments, just as Menendez's presence undermined the political case against Trump in 2018. But Democrats may have only delayed their headache because Menendez is up for re-election in 2024. His travails could give Republicans a chance at taking his seat. Oh, yes, they would have no chance otherwise, even though they almost took out powerful Governor Phil Murphy in 2021 without Trump endorsing the opponent. Now let's find out more about this doctor whose sentence was commuted by Donald Trump as he left office. This is the Palm Beach Post, January 20th, 2021. Trump commutes sentence of Dr. Salmon Melgen, eye doctor found guilty of Medicare fraud. In one of his final acts as president, Donald Trump pardoned and commuted the sentences of 143 people, including a Palm Beach County doctor who some federal prosecutors say was connected to the biggest Medicare fraud case in U.S. history. Dr. Salmon Melgen, who was serving a 17-year sentence for healthcare fraud, had his sentence commuted by Trump on Wednesday, along with others, including former White House advisor Stephen Bannon and South Florida rapper Kodak Black. Melgen, a 66-year-old retinologist, had eye clinics from Port St. Lucie to Delray Beach. He was convicted in 2018 after investigators said he falsely diagnosed and treated hundreds of elderly patients for macular degeneration, defrauding Medicare and other insurers out of millions of dollars over the years. On Wednesday, Melgen said he was grateful for Trump and for recognizing the injustice he had endured. Through the years, Melgen has maintained his innocence. Throughout this ordeal, I have come to realize the very deep flaws in our justice system and how people are at the complete mercy of prosecutors and judges, Melgen said in a prepared statement. As of today, I am committed to fighting for unjustly incarcerated people. Upon the commutation of his sentence, Trump's White House released this statement in explanation. President Trump commuted the sentence of Salmon Melgen. This commutation is supported by Senator Bob Menendez, Representative Mario Diaz-Balart, numerous members of Brigade 2506, Colonel Mark D. Holton, as well as his friends, family, and former employees. Dr. Melgen was convicted of healthcare fraud and false statements. Numerous patients and friends testified to his generosity in treating all patients, especially those unable to pay or unable to afford healthcare insurance. So make of that what you will, but there is clearly something going on here behind the scenes. I have talked at great length about how Donald Trump is always in mid-negotiation, and it doesn't matter who he's negotiating with. There can be deals with everybody. Donald Trump knows what he wants. He knows what he needs. If you've ever read The Art of the Deal, you understand that he has a mental map of all of the things going on, all of the tasks that need to be completed in order to complete the deal. And his goal is getting the deal done and achieving the desired outcome. He does not have to like or respect the people he's dealing with. He only needs to be able to achieve the goal he has set out to achieve. Is there some deal made between Donald Trump and Robert Menendez? Well, who knows? But right now we have the uniparty left trying to get Robert Menendez to resign, unless that is a smokescreen, and it very well could be, but it's much more likely that they do want him to resign so they can have a hand-picked candidate avoiding the primary, going into the race as an incumbent, a new Democrat rising star, rather than this old guy who's been accused of corruption. That makes complete and total sense from a Democrat perspective, from a regime perspective, to legitimately want to replace Robert Menendez. We have the uniparty right going after Robert Menendez, showing that the Democrats are in fact very corrupt. And all of that is fine. They're also trying to tie Donald Trump to Robert Menendez, as they will, of course, do. Everything that happens can be construed in some way as bad for Donald Trump. That is their goal and mission all the time. That is what their hot takes are trying to do. It's race, it's gender, it's how does this negatively affect Donald Trump? Those hot takes are going to get a lot of attention, so they will have a never-ending supply of them. They will keep generating new ones all the time. Donald Trump was caught in a prank phone call last time, giving some support to Menendez. He commuted the sentence of someone linked to Menendez and that same corruption. And now he is saying that despite Menendez's corruption, all of the other Democrats should resign because everyone is even more corrupt than Robert Menendez is. Now let's leave all that aside for a moment and jump back to 2017. This is the piece just cited by David Graham. This is the one by Matt Ford in The Atlantic. The date is October 19th, 2017. Has the Supreme Court legalized public corruption? For a few days earlier this month, it looked like the years-long corruption probe targeting New Jersey Senator Bob Menendez would fall apart 7 weeks into his trial. At issue was the prosecution's, quote, stream of benefits, end quote, theory, which argues that the steady flow of donation and gifts from a wealthy Florida doctor to the Democratic senator and the flow of favors from the senator to the doctor amounted to quid pro quo corruption. During a hearing last week, Judge William Walls seemed to signal that the argument was dead on arrival by citing a recent Supreme Court ruling that has vexed public corruption investigators across the country. I frankly don't think McDonnell will allow that, Walls told prosecutors, referring to the decision in McDonnell versus United States that fundamentally changed the standard for bribery. So the Supreme Court case that overturned Jack Smith's prosecution of Bob McDonnell fundamentally changed the standard for bribery in the United States of America and how judges would be able to interpret issues of public corruption going forward. Let's continue. Walls eventually decided to let the case proceed, declining to throw out most of Menendez's charges. But the close call underscores the continuing fallout from McDonnell last year. That ruling, like a series of others from the court in recent years, recast actions once eschewed in politics as reasonable behavior for elected officials. The justices have portrayed these rulings as necessary on First Amendment grounds, but the long-term effects could imperil the public's faith in democratic institutions. Now, Matt Ford here at The Atlantic seems to be insinuating that this court is actually accepting of public corruption, and they decided that in the 8-0 decision to overturn Jack Smith's improper conviction of Bob McDonnell. He's suggesting that the Supreme Court, because they approve of public corruption, being under Donald Trump at all, this is 2017, are going to do something so dramatic as overturn the conviction of a former governor by Jack Smith. Again, to accept the regime interpretation of this situation, you have to believe something that is so extraordinarily unlikely. It wasn't some split decision where the corrupt Donald Trump judges changed everything. They didn't even have the quote-unquote corrupt Donald Trump judges at that point. Back to The Atlantic. The case narrowed what could be defined as an official act under federal corruption statutes, the quo of a quid pro quo, so to speak. Since McDonnell, it only applies to direct exercises of a government official's power, like voting for legislation or signing an order. More seemingly mundane activities, like urging other officials to intervene in someone's favor or setting up meetings for donors, do not qualify. Before the decision, federal prosecutors brought cases against Democrats and Republicans alike by arguing that official act applied to all sorts of actions taken by public officials. Former Virginia Governor Bob McDonnell, a Republican, was convicted in 2015 after taking more than $175,000 in luxury gifts, personal loans, and more from Johnny Williams, a Virginia businessman who received favors from the governor. On appeal, McDonnell argued his actions were part of being an elected official and fell beyond what federal bribery laws could prohibit. It's worth noting that this is starting to sound a whole lot like what they're putting Clarence Thomas threw. The Supreme Court agreed. Chief Justice John Roberts, who wrote the court's opinion, appeared to anticipate a public backlash. There's no doubt that this case is distasteful. It may be worse than that, he wrote. But our concern is not with tawdry tales of Ferraris, Rolexes, and ball gowns. It is instead with the broader legal implications of the government's boundless interpretation of the federal bribery statute. All 8 justices sided with McDonnell, with the 9th seat vacant after Antonin Scalia's death in February. The concern of the court was that the prosecution not define official act, which is what the statute there required, too broadly, Malloy said. And this is a woman they quoted earlier, Tara Malloy of the Campaign Legal Center. Going on. They thought that official act, according to the prosecution, was basically anything a public official did by reason of their position or through the resources of their position. And the court said, no, no, no. So apparently the thinking here was that it was too easy for corruption charges to be brought in any case where the regime, potentially, felt like removing an official from office. In the normal course of them doing their job, they would inevitably end up in situations like these, and if their potential future decisions happen to align with the needs or the goals of the person they had interacted with, then they could be accused of public corruption and abusing their office. So the court basically decided to narrow the definition of what was considered an official act in their overturning of Jack Smith's prosecution of Bob McDonnell. And now that issue is coming back into the spotlight as the fake president is accused of public corruption. So what we're seeing is that this story now gets to be aired in public. The public gets to have a conversation about what constitutes an official act, what constitutes public corruption. All of these issues are being brought back to the fore. I've said many times that we are going to see all of these issues rerun again and again and again until people get it. And once enough of the class understands, then we can move on. We are essentially being taught civics lessons through all of these various stories that come up in real life and what we are shown and told about real life. The better we learn our lessons here, the better we will understand the world around us, which hopefully should allow us to make better decisions in our own lives and be better at spotting problems and malfeasance by the government so that we do not allow this infiltration and this corruption of our society again in the future. And perhaps we might even pass these lessons down for generations, making a better future for all of us, exactly as the founders intended, before we all decided to just watch TV instead. Back to the Atlantic, and we'll skip down a bit. If it hasn't already, McDonnell could affect how prosecutors build corruption cases and limit the range of behaviors for which they'll pursue charges. Those watching the Menendez case in New Jersey could be even more motivated to do so. But Malloy also warned that McDonnell fits into a broader pattern of how the Roberts Court approaches corruption in politics and what it could do in future cases. And remember, this is 2017. And we'll skip down to the end. McDonnell also came down as federal prosecutors were preparing to go to trial against Menendez, a senator since 2006. At the crux of the case is his friendship with Salmon Melgen, a wealthy Florida ophthalmologist and frequent campaign donor. Prosecutors have depicted Menendez as a personal legislator of sorts to Melgen. He allegedly used his political influence to help obtain visas for Melgen's girlfriends, secure contracts for him in the Dominican Republic, and intervene in a medical billing dispute with the Department of Health and Human Services. Menendez has denied any wrongdoing, and his lawyers argue the favors don't rise to the newly heightened standard of official acts. Federal prosecutors, for their part, argue that the stream of benefits that flowed from Melgen to Menendez meet the threshold under federal law without linking specific quids to specific quos. So the point here is that because Menendez and Melgen had this relationship where Melgen would continue donating to Menendez and Menendez would keep doing things that aligned with Melgen's interests, it didn't matter that there was any specific quid pro quo. That's what was being argued, and then the McConnell decision restricted that. Even though Walz declined to dismiss the charges against the lawmaker, He could still dismiss some of them later in the trial if the prosecution fails to present enough evidence. And like McDonnell himself, Menendez could also challenge any convictions under the stream of benefits theory on appeal. Behind these legal doctrines and prosecutorial theories are questions about the popular legitimacy of the Republican system, about voters being able to trust that officials they elect aren't the puppets of the country's richest patrons. That's so cute back in 2017. What McDonnell and other recent public corruption rulings risk are institutions where cash and favors flow freely, where consequences are exceptional, and where public vice is made indistinguishable from civic virtue. No Americans expect a government of saints, but they expect their government to be able to root out the sinners in its midst. Yes, the lofty view of the regime when they have decided to dispose of one of their own. And so before we get into the last part here, let's just review. We have Senator Bob Menendez indicted for public corruption, gold bars, cash in his house, favors to Egyptians, favors to New Jersey businessmen. Menendez says he's not guilty. Democrats come out asking for him to resign. They get to look like they are strongly opposed to public corruption, even while supporting the fake president who is probably the most corrupt public official in American history. And they would get the political benefit of hand selecting a new Democrat senator in New Jersey who would then run as an incumbent and look powerful, at least in a narrative sense, in the election next fall for New Jersey Senate. Then we have the history of Robert Menendez and the man who was convicted alongside him, Salmon Melgen, whose sentence was then commuted by Donald Trump, who, it seems, maybe supported Menendez in some sense back then. And he comes out now saying that the rest of the Democrat senators should resign if they're going to call for Menendez's resignation, while still agreeing that Menendez is corrupt. And all of that links directly to the overturned conviction by Jack Smith. That is a whole lot of dots connecting. But let's go back even a little bit further. This is MSNBC on March 10th, 2015. Watching a GOP conspiracy theory blossom. This is before Donald Trump even came down the escalator. This is way in the before times. Senator Ted Cruz looked a little silly when he argued Senator Bob Menendez may face criminal charges because he disagrees with the White House on Iranian policy. Yesterday, however, he quickly discovered he had some company among Republicans who were equally eager to appear foolish. Yesterday morning, for example, Lindsey Graham suggested he's sympathetic to the conspiracy theory too. After a Monday morning speech in New Hampshire, South Carolina Senator Lindsey Graham told Bloomberg Politics that the Menendez allegations did not sit right with him. All I can say is they were leaked, Graham said. He wasn't actually charged officially. They leaked the fact that he may be charged, is going to be charged. I hate it when that happens for anybody. I like Bob. Like everybody else, he's innocent until proven guilty. He's been a champion on the Iranian nuclear issue. It just doesn't smell right. By yesterday afternoon, Senator Mark Kirk of Illinois went even further. And how about that? A Republican senator from Illinois back in 2015. But old Tammy Duckworth replaced him. Senator Mark S. Kirk became the latest Republican to suggest reports of corruption charges against Senator Robert Menendez are the result of politically motivated leaks by the Justice Department. Bob Menendez has been an excellent partner for me on the Iran stuff, and I'm worried now by leaking stuff from Justice, it's politically motivated to silence Bob for his work on Iran, which he should be praised for, said Kirk. Conservative media figures from Fox News and the Wall Street Journal are on board too. At the risk of spoiling Republicans' fun, this is impossible to take seriously. Indeed, take a step back and consider how ridiculous this looks in the broader context. The Obama administration's Justice Department appears poised to prosecute a sitting Democratic senator, and Republicans are outraged. You see how effective the controlled opposition paradigm can be, and this dynamic can be in terms of the narrative. It's just the party designations that make this situation impossible. There's no way a Democrat would harm another Democrat and that Republicans would be upset about it. The substance of the issues, the substance of the claims, that doesn't matter at all. All that matters is the little d next to somebody's name or the little r next to somebody's name. As we discussed yesterday, there's literally nothing to substantiate the conspiracy theory. The investigation into Menendez's actions began long before the recent debate over U.S. policy towards Iran. For that matter, though Cruz has accused the Justice Department of announcing a pending indictment, in reality, there has been no such announcement. What's more, there's no real reason for the Obama administration to even consider such a brazen abuse of federal law enforcement. Menendez disagrees with the White House on Iranian diplomacy, but the New Jersey Democrat is already giving the administration the time it needs to see the process through. Even as an electoral matter, Cruz's conspiracy theory is hard to take seriously. The president and Menendez clearly aren't on the same page when it comes to Iran, but on the vast majority of issues, the senator and Obama agree. Why in the world would the White House try to cut off a fellow Democrat at the knees, especially given the fact that if Menendez goes, Governor Chris Christie would appoint a temporary Republican replacement? I don't imagine GOP conspiracy theorists want my advice, but there's a more obvious way to proceed. If a Democrat senator faces criminal charges and finds himself accused of corruption, then tie him to other Democrats and argue there's something rotten in the party. The current Republican tack seems backwards. Menendez appears likely to face an indictment, and to hear Republicans tell it, this is all the White House's fault. So this MSNBC writer, Steve Bannon, uses the Democrat-Republican controlled opposition paradigm to suggest there's absolutely no way that the Obama White House would have wanted to take out Senator Bob Menendez based on his position relative to the Iran deal. All of that is absolutely nuts. And let's jump back to the present day, where Steve Bannon, the MSNBC writer, is still writing for MSNBC and covering this very issue once again. This is from today. Menendez's indictment leads to weird GOP conspiracy theories again. It's easy to forget that when Senator Bob Menendez was indicted the first time during Barack Obama's presidency, a striking number of Republicans, including Senator Lindsey Graham of South Carolina, publicly speculated about whether the New Jersey Democrat was being targeted because he was a skeptic of Obama's policy toward Iran. Such chatter was absurd at the time, and it fares no better in hindsight. But as Menendez faces a new round of criminal allegations, the right is back with a fresh set of conspiracy theories that make even less sense. And he makes the argument that people on the Trump side of things, on the MAGA side, the MAGA extremists, the hard-right Republicans, they're claiming that the Southern District of New York is bringing these charges on behalf of the illegitimate Biden regime to make it look like the Justice Department is actually impartial, so that Donald Trump cannot claim this two-tiered system of justice. They tried to run that same narrative in the aftermath of Hunter Biden being indicted for the gun charges. They made the case that if Joe Biden's Justice Department was willing to indict Joe Biden's own son, there is absolutely no way there could be a two-tier system of justice. That was proof. This indictment of Menendez, a Democrat, is even more proof. It's not only not a two-tiered system of justice going after their political opponents, it is equal justice, and so equal that they will go after their own family members and people from their own party. Except Hunter Biden's indictment is a very, very tiny charge relative to what Hunter Biden has actually done, and this Menendez thing is just the same thing coming around again. It's not like Joe Biden has tasked his Justice Department with ridding the U.S. government of corruption, even when that corruption comes from Biden's own party. That's the sort of thing they only do in China. These two relatively minor examples are what prove the illegitimate administration is actually very committed to equal justice under the law. So the conspiracy theory here that Bannon is pointing out, he's saying it's a conspiracy theory for all of these GOP people to be suggesting that the reason this indictment is happening is because the illegitimate president and his administration and Justice Department are trying to project the principles of equality under the law. The last time the conspiracy theory was about Menendez's position on the Obama-Biden agenda when it comes to Iran. Bannon said that was a crazy conspiracy theory, and this time, this excuse, crazy conspiracy theory. And remember that conspiracy theory from last time? Even up till today, it's still totally and completely crazy. Except there's just one little problem. And that problem is that this article was printed 2 weeks ago in The Hill. Menendez voices concerns about $6 billion U.S.-Iran prisoner swap. Now, we haven't talked about the U.S.-Iran prisoner swap yet, but this article gives some outline of that. Senate Foreign Relations Committee Chairman Bob Menendez expressed concerns Monday amid reports that the Biden administration agreed to unfreeze $6 billion for Iran in exchange for 5 U.S. prisoners. So Iran, this terrorist state, we are told, gets $6 billion to give us back 5 people. Donald Trump got back, I think the number is 57 people, without spending any money at all. Joe Biden, if you recall, had to send an international arms dealer back to Russia in exchange for that guy who plays in the WNBA, Brittany Griner. Now he's sending people back to Iran in exchange for 5 Americans, but he's also throwing in $6 billion that will be unfrozen. Menendez said one of the concerns about negotiating for the release of American prisoners unjustly detained by foreign adversaries is that it encourages hostile nations to take more Americans hostage in the future. And that is the exact same point Donald Trump makes, by the way. This is an example of why we have to go ahead and make it very clear to Americans that they cannot travel to certain places in the world where they are likely to ultimately become a hostage. Until we do that, we will constantly be in a set of circumstances where the United States faces negotiations to free detained Americans, Menendez told reporters Monday. He said he doesn't think Congress will vote on the deal and declined to say how he would vote if it came to the Senate floor. We'll see if it comes to the floor. I don't think it will, Menendez said. Asked about Republican criticism that the Biden administration is creating incentives for more hostage-taking by allowing $6 billion in frozen Iranian funds to move from South Korea to Qatar, Menendez said this is one of the concerns. Senate Republicans excoriated the deal, which also includes the release of 5 Iranian prisoners. So that's weird, isn't it? Menendez was opposed to the Obama-Biden administration's position on Iran back in 2015, and right after that came the corruption charges on Bob Menendez. And Lindsey Graham pointed it out at the time, Ted Cruz pointed it out at the time, other Republicans did as well. The MSNBC writer called it a conspiracy theory. He now says that even with all of that hindsight of these last 8 years, it remains a conspiracy theory that the corruption charges against Menendez had anything to do with his position on Iran. Well, now we have a new set of corruption charges against Menendez 2 weeks after he came out and publicly disagreed with the Obama-Biden administration's position on Iran. And I know everyone, especially the DeSantis Simps, are trying to score points on Donald Trump because he messed up and said Obama instead of Biden. Totally messed up because they're so different. Everybody knows that the Obama-Biden administration was back then. And now this is just the Biden administration and Obama's not in the picture. Except, of course, Obama is in the picture. He's standing right off to the side, or maybe just down below in the basement where he has a little earpiece and tells Joe Biden what to do, just like he said on TV he wanted to do. But I know it's so hard to believe when it comes directly out of their mouths. Like they would never actually be saying what they were doing in plain English to everybody. So all of the very smart people in the world who can figure that very smart thought out assume then that it must be something else, and they will make excuses about all the other things it could be to never simply accept what they just said out of their own mouths in public. But here's the thing. One of the most discussed articles of the day appeared in the outlet Semaphore The article is quite long. You can find the archived version of it, which will allow you to read the full article, in the info stream on Telegram. That is at t.me/veryreasonable. And just search the keyword semaphore, SEMAFOR, inside Iran's influence operation. Now, there is a smaller recap of that article that I'm going to get into in just a second. But if you are interested in this subject, I also encourage you to read another article that appears close by in the info stream from a website called Iran International. It's iranintl.com. That article is entitled Inside Tehran's Soft War, How Iran Gained Influence in U.S. Policy Centers. But for now, we will just hit the summary of this semaphore article in AmericanMilitaryNews.com. Obama-Biden admins infiltrated by Iran. A new report claims that senior Iranian foreign ministry officials executed a secret influence operation in 2014 to strengthen Iran's position on global security matters, especially its nuclear program, by establishing a network of influential researchers and academics in the United States and Europe. According to emails obtained by Semaphore and Iran International, the influence operation, known as the Iran Experts Initiative, provided diplomats working for President Hassan Rouhani with access to influential policy circles during former President Barack Obama's administration. Semaphore reported at least 3 people in the operation were either serving as aides or later became aides to Robert Malley, the Biden administration's special envoy to Iran, whose security clearance was suspended earlier this year. According to Semaphore, participants within the Iran Experts Initiative were high-profile op-ed and analysis writers who routinely shared information on social media and television, urging for a nuclear compromise between Iran and the United States. The emails obtained by Semaphore and Iran International indicate that the Iran Experts Initiative was launched after Rouhani's 2013 election. At the time, Rouhani was attempting to press for a nuclear agreement deal with Western nations. The emails claimed that Iran's foreign ministry used the Institute for Political and International Studies think tank to connect with 10 core members of the Iran Experts Initiative in order to promote the potential for a nuclear deal between Iran and the United States, which was eventually reached in 2015. This initiative, which we call Iran Experts Initiative, is consisted of a core group of 6 to 10 distinguished second-generation Iranians who have established affiliations with the leading international think tanks and academic institutions, mainly in Europe and the U.S. Saeed Khatibzadeh, an Iranian diplomat and future foreign ministry spokesman, wrote in a 2014 email to Mostafa Zahrani, head of the Institute for Political and International Studies think tank. Additional emails obtained by Semaphore and Iran International reveal another correspondence just 1 week later, where Khatibzadeh explained that he had gained the support of Ariane Tabatabai and Dina Esfandiari, both academics he had met with in Prague. We 3 agreed to be the core group of the IEI, Khatibzadeh wrote. Tabatabai is the Pentagon's chief of staff for the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Special Operations, which is a position that requires a U.S. security clearance. According to Semaphore, Tabatabai previously worked on Mali's Iran nuclear negotiation team under the Biden administration. Esfandiari currently serves as a senior advisor to the International Crisis Group think tank, which Mali led from 2018 to 2021 on North Africa and the Middle East. Zahrani and Khatibzadeh touted the success of the Iran Experts Initiative in an internal email correspondence with their superiors. Following our phone conversation, I attached here for your review only a few of the most significant works of some of our friends published during the week after the Lausanne Framework Agreement was reached. Khatibzadeh wrote in Farsi. We were in constant contact and worked vigorously around the clock. Some friends performed as resourceful as a media outlet all by themselves. So we have Obama-Biden administration corruption vis-a-vis the Iran nuclear deal coming back to the fore, and alongside it, the parallel with Bob Menendez in both situations. And that brings in this Trump commutation of Salmon Melgen, and it brings in the new standards for public corruption and bribery that came as a result of the overturned Jack Smith conviction of former Virginia Governor Bob McDonnell. This overturning that Trump mentions all the time when talking about that psychopath, that sociopath, that deranged lunatic Jack Smith, who is now the special counsel bringing the charges about the documents and about the J6 insurrection, following Trump's claims of a stolen election that he didn't even believe himself. All of that wrapped into a nice package. And on the other side, we have Democrats saying that Menendez should resign so that they can prove that they have an equal system of justice, not a two-tiered system of justice. They would always rid the government of corruption wherever it existed if only they had the opportunity, despite the fact that they continue to support perhaps the most corrupt American public official in our history. And they are even playing it to hand select the next Democrat senator from New Jersey. Get rid of Bob Menendez because he's going to be a weakened candidate going into that 2024 race. Let's have the Democrat governor select the new senator, and that senator will then win in a stolen election next fall in New Jersey. It'll be much easier to make the case for that senator, that new Democrat rising star under Cory Booker's wing. The regime will happily carry on as normal, and the uniparty right controlled opposition is happy to help them because they can figure out angles for why all of this actually makes Donald Trump look really bad and proves how unfit he is for president. It's quite a story. You can't get that from the hot takes. Now, I may be back tomorrow, but I also might take the day off tomorrow. I'm trying to catch up on a lot of things, and the episodes from yesterday and today actually already account for like 3.5 hours. So I feel like maybe people might want to catch up a little bit. I may see you tomorrow, but if not, I will definitely be here Thursday talking about whatever ridiculousness emerges from the second fake primary debate among the establishment GOP also-rans. So I might be back tomorrow, but maybe more likely Thursday at the same reasonable time on the same reasonable podcast network. I don't have a network. Masks and lockdowns don't work. They lied to you about a pandemic, and Joe Biden will never be president.
In my mind, that's the end game.
If you're listening to this episode for free, you can support me and support the show and the work I do by signing up for a paid subscription at imyourmoderator.substack.com. You can do so for as low as $50 a year or $5 a month. Comes out to under a quarter per episode, and you'll blast right through the paywall for all of the writing. The merch store is www.cancelcouture.com, and you can find everything else by heading to Linktree, linktree.com/imyourmoderator. And I'll see you soon out on the range. It's